Hi everybody and welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight we are looking at COVID, social work and the future of social work. So if we were in a real life place, if anybody can remember that far back, I'd be the person kind of just holding the door open while you got your seat, got yourself comfy. So I'm just going to chat to you for a few minutes. I'm going to be looking in the chat because that's how we're going to communicate tonight. So the question I want to ask you tonight is the usual. Where in the world are you? What area of social work are you studying or practicing? Are you qualified? Are you a student? That kind of thing. But also, as we always have a specific question, and tonight is about COVID, one of our guest speakers said that the new variant of COVID, Omicron, sounds like a transformer. Bear with me, this will make sense. So it sounds like a transformer. So what I want to know is, if you were a transformer, what would you transform into? So you know the transformer robot type things. I can see Kat is like, oh, good question.
Actually, almost at the end of our third season of webinars, we got season 4 planned well underway, and we plan these sessions now. When we first started, of course, we didn't. It was literally week by week, what are we going to do? But then over the summer, we tried to plan out for the whole of this season. So, you know, from September through to Christmas. And so I spoke to Farah and Sharon back in May, I think, May or June, we were talking about, okay, we'll do this webinar and we'll look at social work post-COVID. It was really hopeful then that we would be post-COVID. Of course, we're not post-COVID, and maybe we need to reframe it. And I'll let Farah tell you how she thought maybe we would retitle it. But it's all about us thinking about changed ways of working, really. And I think there's going to be some fascinating thinking and learning tonight. I spent today with a group of newly qualified workers, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting was I've been chatting to people who've been social workers for a long time and talking about changed ways of working. And as you'll know, because we've talked about it in webinars, I've talked about moral injury with them and all of that. The new social workers that I was with today said, but we don't know any different. So to us, this is social work. And I think that's really interesting, that maybe some of those of you who are first year students, this will be social work to you, but maybe thinking about the impact on social work of COVID, I think is helpful to all of us. So I'm not going to talk for any longer. I'm going to get my notepad out. I'm going to take my notes. It's a shame that my Social Work England registration came through this morning. I got my registration done quite a while ago. I was just thinking it'd be great CPD, but this could be my next bit of CPD for Social Work England. So I've got it in the bag ready for next time. So I'll be taking lots of notes and learning lots, and I'll come back to things at the end of the session. But I'm going to just hand over to Farah and to Sharon, who are going to introduce themselves and then take us through the session. So it's over to you, Farah.
Thank you, Siobhan. Hi, everyone. My name is Farah Khan. I co-chair the National Principal Social Work Network with my close friend and buddy and co-chair Sharon Davidson. And the picture on the screen is one that's quite sentimental to us, because the pictures that we both had taken in the midst of when we thought was kind of just the year of COVID and it'd be over. So it's in 2020 when we first started chairing together that I was sat at home and Sharon was sat at home, and we were doing a blog together, and we just took a natural picture for it. So that's why we always use those pictures. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague and friend and buddy, Sharon.
Hi, I'm Sharon Davidson. What I realised when we did the slides for this, I realised how many different hairstyles I've also had during COVID. So this is what I've got now is probably hairstyle number 5, I think. So I'm Sharon Davidson. I co-chair the National Principal Children and Families Network with Farah, and that is a network of principal social workers nationwide across England, and there's an adult equivalent. So we're really looking forward to having the conversation with you tonight, and we're pitching it as a conversation. So really want you to engage with us through the chat and through questions, and our colleagues will help steer some of that out, because I can't see the screen. I can't see the chat, or I reduce it because I don't want to get distracted by the chat. So, but yeah. So really pleased to be here, and thank you for indulging us in our conversation with you today.
And I guess it's when Siobhan was talking about, we did meet in May, and almost kind of everyone was running out of a bit of steam with COVID, and we were hoping that it would, we were trying to visual life post-COVID, and we're going to spend a bit of time reflecting on how our thought process and how that's impacted and how we've coped with the journey. But just before the webinar, when we were thinking together, I actually thought, well, maybe it's social work with COVID, because it's hard to see a post-COVID at the moment. So maybe we need to think about the evolving world around us, and it's social work with COVID, because we're never going to have certainty. So yeah, today is about reflecting on where we are, what we've learned, and what next for us. We are reflectors, aren't we, Sharon? We spend so long reflecting with each other, and that's why. So that's why we've connected. Although we connected in the virtual world, we've only met this year in person, but we formed a friendship and a social work bond and a co-working relationship through connections. And I think where you connect and you have reflective spaces together, just like we're doing tonight, that's kind of been one of the highlights for me of the past couple of years, is that I've been able to connect with people nationally and internationally, and I think that's been the learning that's brought, and the richness has been quite important. But within that, we've learned a lot about ourselves. And so kind of, we've learned the importance of the connections we make and what we get from our connections as well, be they personal or professional. And I think that, well, I know that I wouldn't have been able to put myself on a national platform, share the national network, without the support from the connections I've had, and without the support from Sharon as a co-chair. That's been vital, because we've been supporting each other. So I think it just reminded Sharon and I, when we were thinking about today, of how important reflections and connections are. Sharon?
And we're going to talk a little bit about our connections, but I think also, as we go through the discussion this evening, it's also thinking about the connections that you need to form or might want to form, and because they won't naturally all be there, and particularly as the point that you made, Siobhan, earlier, about, for some of you on the call tonight, this is social work for you. So we're going to think a little bit about that, and what that reality might look like going forward. And what you might need to be thinking about in terms of your own connections.
So I guess when we're thinking about reflecting of what we've been through, you can't help but look back, can you? And think about trying to visualise a pre-COVID time. For some of us, it's becoming more and more faint. And I think what we thought was normality has probably changed forever. And so when I look back and I think of the first lockdown and how that happened, and how suddenly there was almost a kind of this, is this real? It felt quite surreal. And then there was an energy attached around that. So it was almost like we went into just an autopilot mode. We all shifted from working in the offices, those of us that were working in offices, the remote working. We were thinking of the practicalities around that. So people having laptops, learning about Teams and Zoom and other platforms. So there was very much practicalities, and those are what drove us. And then there was almost a sense of trying to, as we do as humans, see the positives in that, and trying to put a positive camaraderie spin on that. So the weather was nice, people were going for walks, they were enjoying time at home. So the narrative around that openly and publicly was quite positive initially, and that was hard. That was hard for people that didn't sit comfortable with. I shared with the team before people joined us that didn't sit comfortable with me. All my working life, I haven't worked from home. I never have worked from home in the different roles I've done. So I was used to long hours with colleagues. I was used to, spending, socialising with colleagues who'd become friends, and also living on my own. That was hard. in lockdown. So although on the surface there was lots of excitement, it wasn't okay and easy for everybody. And I had friends and colleagues who had young children, who had caring responsibilities, and you'd see people trying to engage in their work and have children and have no separation. So those blurred lines between home and work became really difficult to manage at times, and the school closures, etc., impacted on that. And we spent a lot of time in the Principal Social Work Network. So prior to COVID, we were meeting in person every few months. We were exchanging information, etc. But we spent a lot of time looking at how do we support colleagues, how do we support practice, and things like visits, where child protection visits were still happening in person, but other visits that maybe didn't have significant risk of harm associated with them. We were looking at how we can manage risk of the pandemic and risk of actually not seeing people that we work with, and so that's, you know, how to manage visits and pulling resources together about guides on how to manage that, and virtual meetings as well. I remember the first virtual meeting I was in, it felt surreal. It felt surreal to have all these heads on your screen. And it's something that we didn't do in social work. We were thrown in overnight, virtual court hearings, not seeing our own family and friends, but also in children's. And I know in adults where the people we worked with weren't seeing family and friends either. And there isn't a separation. You know, we are all human beings, whether we're on the receiving end of the service or the delivery end of a service. And so that caused a lot of isolation for people, and support networks to not being able to engage with people. And so there was vulnerability attached with that amplified inequality. And whilst lots of services can have waiting lists, or they can pull out, or they can pause, social work, whatever field of social work you work in, cannot pause. And so that presented extra pressure on social workers, placements for students as well, and we'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later. Sharon, do you want to add anything to that part?
Yeah, I guess the flip side of it, there was also a level of excitement, because what the possibilities became, you know, it became easier for practitioners to try things in a different way. So what I know from my own authority and talking to principal social workers and other people I know, was that we started to see a lot more creativity in terms of how we were engaging, particularly with young people. So we were entering into the virtual world that young people have been part of for a long time. And the bureaucracy that sometimes constrained some managers in thinking about different ways of working, suddenly those barriers went down, because we were all having to think differently. So you had, you know, when we look back, we had a kind of a mixed picture. We had opportunities and possibilities. So I've been a qualified social worker for nearly 30 years, and you're all thinking, gosh, she's so young. I love that story. I say that all the time. But there was no way in my radar, and I'm someone that always wanted to and do embrace of the technology to support with. I would never have considered virtual court hearings. I wouldn't have thought that it was possible to do, but here we are, 18 months or so on, where we've gone through court hearings, we've had meetings, we've done all sorts of different things within the virtual world, but it sometimes has come at a cost, because the boundaries between home and work have sometimes become quite challenging for colleagues. And I guess for those of you who are just starting your social work career, it's kind of thinking about, well, what does a home visit mean? So if you're completely new to practicing, it's kind of, well, how do we get the balance? And so that's some of the things that we'll think about. But yes, the year has brought possibilities and opportunities, but it has not come without a cost to individuals in terms of the impact of COVID on us personally, in terms of our own friends and families. In terms of our colleagues, I've had colleagues that have died during the year as a result of COVID, and the devastation that that brings, as well as, you know, people experiencing loss and stuff in a very different way to what we would have experienced before. But the opportunities that it's given us to think about how we engage with, particularly in our context, with children and families, but also within adults, the use of technology to support independence and artificial intelligence, and how you use those mediums to support people in their own homes and in their own spaces.
So I guess, you know, we're kind of, if we're looking at impact on individuals, but impact on organisations as well, we can't ignore things like isolation, anxiety, worry, impact on mental health, on physical health. There's a financial impact. People working from home comes at a cost. You know, people would be heating their house where they wouldn't be heating homes before. They'd be out at work all day. And I think that we've got to add all of those things up. There was a financial impact for people whose children were at home, who would usually be at school. It increased pressure as the boundaries blurred for the people, who use services. It also blurred for people who deliver services. And support networks changed. And I think that that's important to remember. Although some support networks were disappearing, other support networks were emerging. You know, Sharon and I will speak about this, because this is, for us, that journey happened. So, you know, previously there was a very much even a north-south divide in social work. For the network, as a principal social work network, we've grown quite strong. And some of that has been because remote working has given us opportunities. I suppose, you know, we have to think about workloads as well. People workloads changed, you know, sometimes those increased. At times they've increased, and I know recently a lot of colleagues are getting infections increasing across the country, and that impacts on what other people have to do and pick up. And that was a pattern at the beginning as well. So that's something that we have to learn to live with in social work when we're living with COVID, that will vary depending on where people are with infection rates, and where and across the country that can look different. The pockets where there's deprivation, and where people are housed in housing that's not appropriate, that's crowded, where people are having you know, more contact with other people just by nature of the living situation, then they're going to be more at risk of exposure to a virus. And so that's going to impact on workloads. And I know for the colleagues, in particular in some of the London boroughs that are quite heavily populated, you know, there was quite an increase. In Leeds, we had a significant increase because we, especially in our deprived areas, but the areas close to where universities were, there was a lot of obviously footfall and people coming into the city. So that has an increase directly on workloads for social workers. And I think we have to live with the change in that, that's going to fluctuate, and the virus has some control over that, and have plans around that. So
sorry,
we kind of
just a point, a point that in relation to the pressure and the workloads. I think that before COVID, we wouldn't have been talking about housing circumstances of social workers. We wouldn't have been talking about the conditions in which people live to do their job, because there was a safety valve, if you like, that even if you were in a multi-occupied housing or housing situation, whether that's within family or house sharing, etc., that was separate from work. And what COVID did was to actually break those barriers down for us. So, you know, as an employer, we certainly in the authority that I've been in, and colleagues are having to think about the context in which people work, and creating opportunities and creating situations that enable them to do their job. But also I know that I've had to have lots of conversations with people, and I've had to have conversations with myself about stopping, because the temptation when you don't have a natural break, because you're not commuting home, is that you just carry on. And in the early part of COVID, when we were all very much housebound, the temptation to keep working and just do a little bit more, became greater. So it's something for us to also kind of think about as we live with COVID going forward. How do we get that balance?
That's a really, these are, like you said, these are things we would have never thought about, because you were able to separate work and home life in a different way. There are some advantages, I think, to actually seeing yourself, your whole self, because I think moving forward in social work, what we see now is a lot of authenticity and people bringing their experiences, whatever those are in life, and being able to apply them to social work. And we see that a lot in students, in newly qualified, that people, are able to be themselves more. And that's really, really good to see, because I think people recognise that, we're citizens of the world, and what happens in the world affects us and affects social work. And I think that when we're thinking about our place in social work and our place in the profession, we're more able to look at ourselves on a more international landscape, and learn on a local, on a national and on an international landscape. Sharon is in our partnership, she's the IT whiz, so she's definitely the brains, because seriously I'd be joining you via a Matchbox and String if it wasn't for Sharon. So what I've learned about IT, I've learned from Sharon. And I think you have a real creativity, don't you, Sharon, with like learning and support for universities and stuff, and students, and thinking about international students, international social workers working in different contexts. We were talking about that earlier, weren't we?
And I think if I look back and I think about conversations I was having in 2018, for argument's sake, about digital learning and how that has a place, people's eyes would kind of glaze over and there'd be one or two people that would nod politely. If I talk about digital learning now, it has a different meaning. We're here, we're talking together in that digital space. So I think the connections that a local, national and international level means that for us as social workers, we have a powerful voice, and it's how we use that voice, whether that's in the relationships we develop and how we engage, or whether that's the broader voice that, say, for someone like Farah and myself, in terms of how do we position our practice knowledge and experience within those kind of wider contexts. So we have regular discussions with the DFE, and what we can bring to those discussions is those local understandings, those local connections, but also that practice understanding. So Farah talked earlier that COVID, through COVID, we developed as a network with Social Work England and others, guides to think about working in this digital world. And we've continued to do that, so that our practice knowledge and our practice understanding is not just sitting locally with me in Surrey or Farah in Leeds, but actually we're sharing that as far and as wide as we're, and that there's, we don't have to hold back, because ultimately it's about how do we improve social work, how do we improve the engagement with people who use our services, and how can we do that together? So I think that if I look at my own social work history, there's the last year has really re-engaged some of the values around social work and connectivity and advocacy and anti-oppressive practice that sometimes I kind of felt in recent years had got a bit lost, and I was probably one of few people that, and it was positioning things around how long someone had been in practice. What I think we have now is how do we keep those connections going in this new world? As I like that concept, Farah, how we live with COVID, how do we practice within a COVID framework? And it will look different locally. So in the last year, Farah and I have had numerous meetings and discussions virtually, but locally we're in different contexts. I work in another authority to where I live, but where I live might be, there might be local restrictions that are not same across the piece. So as a network, when we come together, we've been able to see just the impact of those local requirements and how that's affected social work practice, how it's affected children and family in different parts of the country. So the term levelling up is used quite loosely politically, but actually for us, from a practice point of view, it has a very different meaning and a different resonance.
And that I think that's really key, because whilst ever I think this virtual space that we've all had to occupy because our spaces around us, the spaces that we were comfortable in, that probably narrowed us, kept us in a certain place, because we saw people who probably spoke the same as us or who reassured us that our way was right. Actually, we've been exposed to a virtual space that's really blown our minds. So when we think about social work across the world, it looks very different. It looks very different, and there are lots of positives in that. So when we think in the UK now, when we talk about asset-based community development, actually, you know, that kind of social work goes on in the world. It goes on everywhere in the world where people are used to drawing on community strengths and building on that. And while as previously that was an exception, now we're looking at more as actually that's the norm, that connecting and learning from people across the world is the norm, and it's becoming more the norm. And I think that, you know, that openness to learning is quite key. So we've often spoken to colleagues. We both have responsibility for learning and development. We've spoken to colleagues internationally who have, you know, might have delivered some training or shared some space with us that, you know, somewhere across the world, from Dubai or from America or from Canada, you know, from where it's in the middle of the night, where the clocks are totally different. We would never have been able to do that. And you know, we're so seeing ourselves as citizens of the world and social workers of the world has taken a different meaning, and we don't sit comfortably in our own surroundings with just the people we know. So I think there's a new kind of practice knowledge that's emerging if we open our minds to it. And I think that for people of my generation, although you probably think, you know, Sharon and I are only in our 20s, you know, we've
I am.
but for people,
the youngest qualified social worker.
You qualified at 4, Sharon.
Yeah.
So for people of our generation, we've had to open our minds, and it's been a real learning curve differently. And I think for younger generations, it's been easier because they were used to making connections. So I think that there's a real strength in those connections.
Just sorry, Farah, just one other point. So just a little bit of an anecdote. So as a network, we come together 3 or 4 times a year. And we use that to kind of share and communicate lots of things, but it's also an opportunity for a bit of CPD. Through the connections, the guru for both Farah and I, and we do a lot of work thinking about anti-racist practice, and we were able to connect with Lena Dominelli and invite her to one of our national events. And so that was great. And if you haven't ever looked at anything around Lena Dominelli, please do, because it still has a lot of relevance to practice now. But what she invited us to think about was about that wider social work connections internationally, and shared with us some observations, some experiences about the impact of COVID in different parts of the world, but also that just thinking about, we're doing a lot, you know, all of us are thinking about sustainability, but kind of thinking about green social work and what does that mean and how does that have an impact. Now, that isn't something that would have been in the radar of a national event for principal social workers. I think that might have interested people on a personal level, and you might have conversations over coffee about that. So the point is that don't narrow your thinking, even if you're in, you know, wherever you're placed or wherever you're working, the context of social work, families and adults and children don't sit in isolation to that wider world. And it's just kind of holding that to in our thinking as we kind of go through whatever the future of practice looks like.
And we can't, I suppose, you know, when we look at the future, we still get excited about social work. So I think I'll know when to hang up my social work badge when I stop getting excited about social work. So I still get excited about the future, because I think that we've been thrown into unpredictability, but actually that's something that has challenged us in a way that we haven't been challenged before. So it challenges us to think differently. And if we can apply that methodology to dealing with COVID and living with COVID, we can apply that to our work, that it's okay to think differently. Just because we've always done things a certain way, it doesn't mean that they are right, and we get comfortable with that. So when we start to think differently and we think of the future, you know, there's 3 areas that have been quite relevant to us. So that's about technology, you know, that we all need the right technology to be able to do the work that we do. And you know, we're in local authority social work in particular, you know, we're quite behind on technology. We're not very technical, and we're catching up. And overnight we had to catch up and equip a workforce to be able to work from home. You know, we're talking about, you know, hybrid working. What does that look like? What does that mean? So sharing workspaces, you know, is that workspaces to go and do work? Is that workspaces to actually share spaces with teams? And also being allowed to, you know, still have the working from home that has worked well for a lot of people. So if they're not stuck in rush hour traffic first thing in the morning or last thing of the day, is that detrimental to actually the service they deliver? But also really important is hybrid learning. I mean, we're sharing this space and we're all learning together. We share a lot of spaces together. But hybrid learning is really important as well, because actually some of your learning you do, you know, you can do some learning in different spaces. What does that look like? And I think that we should, and I don't mean just training, you know, we should be open to learning in all our interactions. And hybrid learning is that, you know, you will learn from a visit to the shop, you'll learn from a journey home, you'll learn from, you know, connections with your family, from conversations. And I think when we open our mind to social work, is about being human. It's about human communication and connection. Then we learn, and hybrid learning is about understanding that we learn in different spaces and that we can learn in the virtual world, but also not to forget that we still learn in our world, that we connect. And that doesn't mean to say being in an office together with colleagues. There are other workspaces that we learn in. So I think it's just thinking broadly about how we learn is key as well, because if we think about that, then we use every opportunity to learn.
What I wanted to think about here is that some of that work and some of that thinking is already happening. There's work that Harry Ferguson, Laura Kelly and Birmingham have been looking at and thinking about. There's also some work that BASWA, British Association of Social Work, with Durham University has done in terms of thinking about looking at the context of social work during COVID and what the challenges have been, and some of that we've talked about today, but also what are the emerging best practice examples that they saw, and how we as a profession transform. And I think one of the key things is that we will evolve over. We have evolved over the last year, and I think we, you know, where we are now, and that sense that we're with COVID, and our optimism in the summer that when we're all vaccinated, that COVID will go away. Clearly, that's not the state it will. I don't know the terminology, but the virus feeds off of how it mutates off of different things. So it might change in its potency, if you like, over time, but it's not going away. So how do we practice in a world that we are authentic and genuine in our practice? And I'm going to come on in a bit to think about what that space might look like. But I guess the other thing that I wanted to highlight and think about with you is that your own responsibility within that. So how do you ensure that you're getting what you need, and how do you articulate that? So for students, when you're doing your learning agreements and you're having those initial discussions when you start your placements, it's been really upfront about what some of the vulnerabilities you might have that need to be understood so that your practice educator and your placement can support you. And it's been brave enough to have those conversations. And for colleagues who are starting in practice or who've been practicing for a while, if things have changed and evolved, or you have a different kind of perspective about your practice, it's kind of talking about that. The other thing I wanted to talk about, so I was really interested in the work that Harry Ferguson has done, and we've had Harry and Laura attend, do work with us as a network, and what they did and what they've continued to do is to look at social work practice in that digital space. So they describe it as hybrid digital social work. I've put the practice bit in, but they talk about hybrid or digital social work versus in-person practice. And so for those of you on the call, there's a mix of people who are very comfortable with the in-person, going out, doing home visits. That's what you know, that's what you're comfortable with. And the digital space may be more challenging. And for those of you who have begun your practice in the last couple of years, maybe the challenge of doing those in-person visits are the bits that feel slightly difficult to conceptualize. And what Farah and I and quite a number of PSWs and the work that Harry Ferguson and others are talking about is that actually the new world, it's both. It's how do you create both those opportunities. I know that I've seen some really wonderful and creative engagement with young people, not just with social workers, but across the multi-agency context. There's a social worker that is in the authority that I'm in that talks about collecting pennies and collecting and how do you build up the currency with young people. And she was thinking about that before the COVID world, but actually in the digital world, that becomes much more meaningful. I've seen examples of police and social workers, other professionals connecting with each other, being able to have meaningful conversations and planning their intervention. And in the virtual world for young people, understanding their world and understanding, so there's some wonderful work that Dr. Peter Buzzy does in terms of thinking about online safeguarding and thinking about when we do, previously we would be talking about doing home visits, we'd be looking at assessments, we were doing that in terms of the home space and we wouldn't do an assessment without considering the home conditions or food, but actually we shouldn't now be doing this assessments without understanding the online world for that young person. What's their connections and are those connections safe? So rather than saying and using social media and iPads and iPhones as a form of punishment when things is actually, what does that mean? Because the identity for lots of young people is tied up in that online world. So it's for us to understand that, but it's also the opportunity to engage with young people. So in my day, when I was practicing, I would take time to understand what might interest that young person. And if they happen to be an Arsenal fan, then that was a bonus, because so am I. So that gave us an immediate connection. But when you're getting to know young people, or if you work with adults, you're finding out what are the things that are meaningful to them. That can still be a way in, an inroad in terms of working in the virtual world, but it's about balancing that, because as Farah, as we talked about earlier, the deficits of the last year has highlighted lots of inequalities, poverty and the impact of poverty, the impact of digital poverty. So DFE mobilising laptops for children and families during COVID because for lots of families, they didn't have access to that. They may have had a phone, and they didn't need to have access to that because that child may well have been able to access that through school. But once school were closed, what do we do? How did they do? So what we wanting to think about is safe spaces for engaging with children and young people. And some of those safe spaces might not be in the home, but how do we do that when we're faced with restrictions? And what the last year has told us is to take advantage of the world around us. So some emerging themes are about walk-in visits as opposed to home visits, arranging to meet with a family in the park, in a vicinity where the children can be running and they can be free, if that's it. But also there's an opportunity to have that kind of what I call shoulder to shoulder talk. So in my practice days, I used to find some of the best conversations I had with young people was when I was collecting them from one inappropriate placement and taking them somewhere else. I'd get more dialogue and more discussion when I'm driving them and they're sitting in the back because I'm not looking directly in eye to eye, or we've gone for a walk. I had a young person I worked with who from London, we placed him in Brighton. Brighton for him was like an alien concept, but just actually walking on the beach and just talking about what he liked, what he didn't like about not being in London, opened up a whole world of and a whole range of dialogue with him that would have taken years to have achieved if we were just sitting in an office. So it's really just kind of thinking about what's your emotional reservoir do you draw on, because the world we're working in isn't without a cost to you as individuals. So you have to have those boundaries within your home environment. If you're in a position where you can create a space which is your workspace, then take advantage of that. But think about how do you build your reservoir so that if we are in that situation in the coming months where we might need to do much more working at home, whether that's nationally or locally because of whichever virus is prevalent at that time, that you're not taken back to where we started at the beginning of last year.
And that's really important, Sharon, because actually when we think about that, so when we're thinking about assessments and a holistic assessment, whether you're working with adults or children and families, the digital world, just like you have to think about for yourself. So we think about internet connection. So for example, if I go and stay with my mother, she never had internet before. And sometimes I go and I help care for her. So we've installed internet for her so I can access internet from there. I know last time I was here in this space, Siobhan was logged on from a caravan somewhere. And so we think about connections, don't we, digitally, wherever we go, but we have to think about those for the people we work with as well. So as part of your assessment, think about the digital world. So for children, like Sharon said, think about their digital friendships and spaces, but also access, so if you're working with an older person, an adult, a vulnerable adult, do they have access? How do they get support? Because it's key, digital poverty is relevant because it matters and it impacts on people's lives, and it's the same for children and families as well. And it's part of an assessment that obviously it's new to social work, but it's important that you include that in your assessments. I guess I just wanted, we were just thinking about working from home and some of the, how we communicate and connect, because people talk a lot, don't they, about communication, and that there's been some losses around how we communicate digitally and remotely. And I was just looking at when we look outside of social work, at research outside, a lot of it is relevant to social work. I was looking at Bill Gates Foundation. I came across it, and some of my family work don't work in the public sector, although most do. And when we think about inequality, we're working from home, often people say it'll be a leveller about gender inequality and diversity, and will allow more women to work from home, people with young children maybe maybe single parents, but actually it can be, you know, we have to be realistic about the expectations of that. So does it reinforce further discrimination? Because do we expect in particular women to be even more superhuman, to be able to, you know, have a fantastic home, do everything for their children and work every hour under the sun and still do things the same? So I thought this research was quite relevant in that, because actually what we do know is digital spaces can, you know, this new world of working can also increase inequality. And you know, there was a previous stigma attached to working from home as well. We know that, people thought it was lazy. But what happens on the back of that is what we hear a lot in social work is people feel guilty if they take a break. So actually, in the office or wherever they work from, wherever you work from in the community, you'd have a journey to a visit. You'd go, you know, to the bathroom. You'd make a drink. You might have 5 minutes chat with a colleague. But at home, there's a lot of guilt associated with that. And I've got to say, I'm giving you permission to let go of that. You know, because we need to let go of that. I've been on a journey with that. So I don't feel guilty if I stand, you know, in my garden for 10 minutes and have a cuppa, because I'd be doing that at work, and there's guilt attached to that, and we've got to let go of that, because that can increase pressure, and it's all very linked. I don't know where I've gone. So I just thought, I'm quite sciencey in my private life. So I'm fascinated by science, and I'm fascinated by how things worked. And I don't know how I ended up in social work, but I did. But I'm quite fascinated by how our brains worked and how we've evolved around COVID and you know what that's looked like. And COVID has had an impact on our brain. You know, there's some early signs that remote working has impacted on our ability to concentrate and spark ideas. You know, impact of isolation is quite relevant as well. And you've all have heard, most of you will have heard of brain fatigue, and that sometimes that you know, because we get our ideas from what surrounds us in the world, that it can limit us. And there was some research done about I was thinking about, you know, what's the research behind this? And in social work, research around this is quite limited. But somebody called Dr. Sinar Habibi, he's the co-founder of Cognitivity Neurosciences, and he talks a lot about the impact of life working during the pandemic, and how we manage that. And initially that overdrive of, you know, having to be in our screens all the time, respond to every email, and how we cope with that. But within that, you know, loneliness and isolation, because that's what it meant for a lot of people, missing. So people who had those connections, be those at work or with family, etc., missing that. And we had lots of social work students, social workers living in shared houses but no contact with their family, you know, and that's really hard. And the loss of that can have a detrimental impact on your cognitive health. And whilst for some people that was short term, because they were able to then connect with family after months, so they looked at different ways of connecting. For other people, there's some long-term consequences of that. You know, we had people that were clinically vulnerable who couldn't see family and friends, people who lived abroad, even if in the UK, you know, the regulations were different across the different nations. So it was really, really hard and took its toll. And I think that it's important to think about that and how we deal with isolation, because what we do know is isolation impacts on our brain, and it can impact on our cognitive ability, and with it comes the sense of fatigue. So we're very resilient, those human beings. So what we did for that is we make connections elsewhere. I was never on Twitter. You know, Twitter would have never appealed on me. I never used it, and I actually use Twitter more than I use any medium now, because I love the connections and I love the learning. And I said to David, I always look out for David's posts because I find them, they always lift me. And you know, and you connect with people you can connect with people and feel like you've got to know people, and there's a richness of learning for that. But our brains have evolved, so we connect in a different way. So that's, that's our brains have evolved forever. But for some of you, where you've done social work and where you were comfortable and you used the digital or the virtual world more, you would have been more comfortable with that. But that depends on where you sat with that previously as well. And there's a richness to that we can still keep. But I guess so there was a negative about loneliness, but one of the positives was, this is really interesting, I was taken back about this, but then I see a lot of kindness, it doesn't surprise me, is actually inclusivity and empathy went up. So that actually increased he did a study of lots of people from different professions, and it was evident, and I know that Microsoft did the same study on the same features, that inclusivity and empathy increased, and inclusive spaces increased. So we had a colleague tonight from the team, from Siobhan's team that joined us, who had a young baby at the beginning of the session, which was lovely to see. But, would she have been able to join with a young baby and see her baby if we were in person somewhere? Sharon and I wouldn't have been able to join after a day of work. So inclusivity increased as well, and those are the positives, and people more a sense of actual community and empathy for each other. And the values of social work are about social justice, and so wherever inclusivity and empathy increase, so does the quality of social work, and so that's been a real positive. I suppose it comes, I know, we're going to spend some time, Siobhan's going to spend a little bit of time on remote working, but it comes, there's pros and cons about remote working, so I won't go too much into remote working, but there's been a real advantage of collaborative spaces to have remote discussions, which didn't exist before. So that was one of the positives that we saw. Sharon, can I go to you?
So I guess just kind of pulling together some of the things that we've been talking about. What we want to, I guess our call out to you is how do we continue to learn together as we live with COVID, as we kind of think about the professional transformation, as BASWA, the paper with BASWA and Durham University was about, as a profession, how are we going to transform in this new these new conditions? I don't want to say new world, because the world is the same, it's just that we're functioning in different ways. How do we grow? How do we think about where our practice frameworks are? What are going to be some of the ethical dilemmas for us as students, as social workers, as managers, as leaders, as academics, in the emerging ways in which we practice? And how do you take care of yourself? So I said before about, understanding you and understanding what what you need in terms of your growth, physically, mentally, spiritually, professionally, and how do you create those conditions to have those needs met? But equally, how do you emerge, for those of you who are new in your practice, what I'd like to invite you to do is to think about the professional you in the digital world and in the in-person world, and how you conduct yourself and how you present yourself are the conversations that I always have with students and newly qualified when I was doing the inductions at the start of their journey wherever I'm working. But I want to have those conversations with people and think about that in the digital world, because there's, you see the top half of me, but that's also what the child and family see. So how do I present myself physically, verbally, and how do I make sure that I am compassionate and caring and humane in the work I do, but I'm also true and authentic in the professional context and conduct, because we have historically had a number of fitness to practice examples going to our regulator about conduct at all levels of practice. What I don't want to see is that as the digital world, as we start to that the conduct is about how people are within that digital space, because we can be ahead of the game around that.
Sorry, Sharon.
That's fine.
Sorry. And it's about, and that's right. And it's how we take care of ourselves and each other, but remembering that we're professionals still, and we have a responsibility, and people that we work with and share spaces with deserve the respect from us that they'd get face to face. So they deserve our full attention, even in the digital world, and they deserve our full respect. We are very privileged to be able to work with people at the most vulnerable point in their lives. We've all needed support at the most vulnerable point in our lives at some point, whatever that looks like.
And it's that, looking at our own vulnerabilities and not using the interaction with whoever you're working with to do that, but actually holding on to some of those feelings for yourself is going to be quite important as well. We were going to ask you to share some reflections, and I think things keep popping up on my screen and I'm trying not to look at that. So I know that there's loads of things that you've been saying as we've been talking. So if we just get your, Siobhan, if you want to do your bit, and then maybe we come back to any, unless there's any burning questions or anything that's come up in the chat. So I'm looking at colleagues who are managing all the technical side to steer us now.
Siobhan, do you want the next slide?
Yeah, you can do. Thank you, Farah. I don't think there was loads in the chat that were questions. I think there was a lot of chat going on about people's experiences. But maybe, Sharon, based on what you've just said there, if we ask people in the chat to share something of their experiences, and hopefully you can now take a look in the chat and use that, hopefully. So I just asked if I could, in a way, almost hijack this session at the end, because there's been some things that have happened for me working as a trainer in this new online world. And listening to what you were talking about, I was really interested there about how creativity's increased and how this has enabled our learning more and so on. But I've noticed some things in working remotely, and I know that a lot of our community that come to our webinars are students or are newly qualified workers. And so I just wanted to run some issues by, I suppose really it was just about raising it. And it might be, Sharon and Farah, that you could tell me what your thoughts are, or it might be that people in the chat could tell me. But I think if we look at what remote means, there's a lot more remote working now. I'm hearing that in a lot of authorities, as opposed to digital or online. A lot of people just talking about remote working. And if you look at what the word remote means, this is the dictionary definition of remote, then it's being in a place situated far from the main centres of population. It's being distant. Now, to me, that's a concern. Students, potentially, and newly qualified workers who are situated far from their colleagues and not doing all of that overhearing telephone calls and getting the support when they're, having a difficult telephone call. Being situated far from is important. I think to me, it's a worry if you think about situated learning theory and how we learn from the situation and things take place. So that worries me slightly as an educator about people being separated too much. The other way of looking at remote, the other dictionary definition is having very little connection with or relationship to. Well, that's hugely dangerous for social work, because social work is all about, as you just said, connections and relationships. But one thing I would say is I think you can create connections and relationships online and in the digital world, as you two have demonstrated, Farah and Sharon. But also, I've not physically met the Social Work Student Connect team, and yet I feel like we really are a team, and we've got some very good relationships that I would never have thought I would have had the depth of relationship that I've got with this team without ever having physically met people. So I think it can happen, but we've got to think about how we create relationships differently. But then the other thing I wanted to throw in was about the word remote, because I'd never thought of it as being part of this, right? I think of because in our house we call it a dibbler. I don't know what you call it in your house, Farah and Sharon, but the remote control, we call it a dibbler. I'd never even thought of the word remote as relating to a remote control, but what it says there in the dictionary definition is you can have these universal remotes that let you operate everything from one handset, and that's a concern for me, especially around the gender issue that you raised, Farah. Is there an expectation that actually you're going to do everything all at once? And the number of times, I can't tell you over the years, because I've home worked for a long time, you know, as a trainer, I'm working at home if I'm not training, but I can't tell you the number of teas I have ruined because I'll think, oh, while that's just cooking, I'll just do this email. And by the time I go back to the tea, it's all burnt. And I think there's so much of, we're almost trying to do everything all at once with almost like this remote control universal thing. And actually, are we doing any of it well? That worries me a little bit.
And that's that point that Farah was talking about. We've got to give ourselves permission to have those boundaries in our home spaces. And how do we position that? How do we organise that so that we're giving ourselves to the work, but we're not doing that at the expense of our home life and our friends and family circumstances. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And like Farah said, you know, I spend a lot of my time living on my own because my husband works away, and then you're almost like, well, I'm on my own anyway. And so I do worry then that sometimes it just spreads too much. But then some of the things I've noticed, and Farah, if you can just go on to the next slide, but only click one picture at a time, because these are some of the issues that I've noticed. So on the next slide, there's lots of pictures, but if you just animate one at a time, I would like to ask you, and I don't know what, you know, I'm not putting you on the spot here for you to answer, but the whole audience, I'd like to ask you about what you've experienced, what you think is and isn't acceptable when we're working remotely. Because for you as students, you go on placement and you're seeing some behaviours that to me, 18 months ago, I would have thought are impossible. And yet you're seeing those and you're learning those, and maybe you're going to employ those. So, you know, let's start off with wearing pajamas. I'm wearing my slippers at the moment, okay? I wear my slippers most days because I don't want to walk on the carpet in shoes. So I'm wearing slippers. How is that? Is that okay to have slippers? Well, what about pajamas all the way up to your, you know, and so you just have a top on, and I know people who have, you know, they've got the whole pajama set on and they're working. I don't know, I'm just, where do our boundaries around this lie? And I think the issue is that we've all got different boundaries with this, and I worry that local authorities are not putting clarity in place for people, or employers are not putting clarity in place. And what can happen, Siobhan, is that if individually we don't think about this, the student or the newly qualified then encounters a manager who has a very strong view about that, and suddenly you're in a situation where there's a question about your conduct or your professionalism. And that's why I was kind of saying a bit about, think about your conduct, think about your professional context now, and what's your boundary. What would you be doing if you were meeting with an individual professional or family or adult in person? What's the difference? If you're in a working context, what's the difference? Yes, we might be a bit more comfortable in our footwear, but does that mean we need to be so relaxed in all our dress? How do we engage? Is that one of the questions that I kind of pose to students and newly qualified and colleagues across the board? It's not just about those just coming into the
It was interesting when I first started going to meetings and experienced colleagues, and you all of a sudden you saw loads of fleeces out because people want to get comfy in their own home, and I've got slippers on. And I guess what I'd say to people is, if you look on YouTube, there's a lot of clips from other industries about what's appropriate and how to create appropriate spaces for yourself, and some really good tips that I started to share with newly qualified social workers in Leeds around how to, you know, create that space. So it was things like, it became quite common that your doorbell was ringing constantly and people were answering the door within, in meetings. It became quite common where people, like you say, in that picture, the pajamas and the top. But I think it is about, if we are going to wear a certain hat, and I don't mean wear a suit at home, but would you go on a visit? So not about footwear, but would you go on a visit in your pajamas? You know, it's about professional respect for the person you work with. And I had a really good manager when I first qualified, and she said to me, you're talking about people's lives and you're invading people's lives, so they deserve respect enough to be able to dress in a way that portrays that, and that's what's always stuck with me. You know, that I mean, I'm dressed more casually than I would in work, but it's about you can see yourself, you can see how you present, and it's important that you're aware of that. So it's important that you're aware of what's in your background, and it's important you're aware of how you present.
Absolutely. So, and I think for students, you know, a lot of the people who are here today are students. And of course, you've got your domains. If you, in England, PCF domains, professionalism is a key part of that, but Scotland, Northern Ireland. So we're not going to be able to talk about each one of these, but these are all real. And I'm going to ask Farah to just click on each one at a time. So, camera off. I cannot tell you as a trainer how soul destroying it is to sit and deliver training that takes hours and hours of preparation and try and make it interactive, and you're just looking at a screen full of camera off, camera off, camera off. Now, I understand some people say it makes your internet a little bit better, all of that, but I know that there are local authorities that I go into where it's common culture, everyone has their cameras on, and there's others where it's just no one has their cameras on, and it worries me. It worries me when you're at university. If all of your cameras are off all of the time, how do your lecturers know you're there? How do you demonstrate that you're actively there? I say, oh, sorry, Sharon, go on.
I have a friend who is a lecturer, and he was delivering a lecture, and the lecture had finished, and someone had their camera off the whole time and didn't realise the lecture had finished, and he stayed on to kind of have the conversation. And so he then started putting in some thinking with them about during the lecture or the seminars, whatever it is that you have the camera on. And that might just be the odd person, but the temptation is very much there that we get distracted. I'll just going to have a look at an email, because I'm not saying anything at the moment, so I'll just do some emails. But actually, it's about our attention at that time and in that space.
It is. And it's about the respect that you show into the person who's delivering training or doing the meeting. I can tell that people have got their cameras on and are typing away and really ignoring me. So the team, you know, it's why the team keep their cameras on, but the team also have learned how important it is to keep cameras on when they've delivered to an empty room, you know. And we're going to have to whiz through these because we don't have long now, so we can't talk about each of them. But smoking, vaping, I can't tell you the first time I was training and somebody lit up a cigarette, I almost went like that, and I thought, well, actually it's their own home maybe. And then now I've just realized sometimes I just see literally cameras of smoke, and every now and again a pair of eyes will appear because the smoke dissipates. So, you know, I think that's not acceptable, and I think if you're going to have a quick vape, put your camera off and then back on again when the smoke's gone, or, you know, but in a meeting definitely don't do it. I mean, I'm talking about whole day online training, but, you know, in a meeting definitely don't do it.
But
the next one, Farah, if you want to go for the next one, people will stop. Sorry, Farah. People will stop believing me when I get to the next few, but they're all true, honestly. But we've got to rush through them now because of finishing. Cats and dogs. I mean, I think it's lovely sometimes somebody's dog pops up or their cat pops up on screen. I think it can bring an energy into the room. But I was talking to a friend of mine who is like a senior manager who was doing a disciplinary meeting with somebody, a really difficult meeting. They both got the cameras on, and apparently the dog was on this person's knee the whole time, and the dog was burping and doing other things I won't say, but, you know, making a lot of noise on screen. And this is a really important, really difficult meeting. And, you know, the senior manager, I'd say, can you just put your dog in the other room or something? So when is it and isn't it appropriate for your dog to pop up on screen, you know? And when is it one of the...
You've got to rewrite these boundaries, haven't you? You've got to think about these things. Yeah, absolutely. So if you're engaging with a child, they might, you know, you might use that as a cat or a dog as an icebreaker. But, you know, if you're in a serious meeting, you wouldn't.
No, absolutely. And if you want to go for the next one, Farah, then the next one is, and this is a true story. This is,
Really?
It wasn't me, but a friend of mine was delivering an all-day training session for a group of newly qualified workers. And apparently it was all going very well and they all had their cameras on because it was a requirement of the principal social worker in that authority that if you were in training, you had your cameras on for the day. And the training's all going very well. But then apparently in the afternoon, one of these newly qualified social workers came back with a head wrapped in a towel. And the friend of mine said, well, I thought, she's been out for a walk at lunchtime. She's had a shower. It's up to her what she does at lunchtime, but, fine. But then apparently through the rest of the afternoon, she proceeded to blow dry her hair, then put curlers in, curling tongs, pin it all up. I put some, apparently it took the whole afternoon. It was a very elaborate hairstyle. And when she was asked about this, she said, I don't see what the problem is. I was listening, I was taking part, I'm going out tonight, so I had to do my hair. That is to me way beyond the boundaries. There's some, maybe you'll sometimes use your dog, you'll sometimes put your dog in the other room. Hair drying, you'll never do. That's what I think. And then the final one, you will not believe me, but it is absolutely true. There may be people in the room who are in this team, I don't know. But I have a friend who is a team manager who says every single team meeting, they have a team meeting online once a month. Every single team meeting, there is a team member who comes along with a big pile of ironing at the beginning, starts the ironing and does all their ironing and neatly piles it up. By the end of the meeting, has got a lovely pile of lovely, neatly folded ironing. And the team manager is saying, it's not on. They are being paid to be at work, absolutely. But she is saying, I don't see what the problem is. It helps me to concentrate on what you're saying. I've got a notepad, I'm taking part. But these are issues about where do you take that? Where do you take that when the person is absolutely, adamantly refusing not to? So I'm not suggesting here you should all go off and spend the afternoon in your meetings doing your hair or doing ironing. Those two are absolutely not, they are not to be done. But some of the other stuff, it's a blurring. It's what is and isn't acceptable. So if you're a student, talk to your practice educator about what is and isn't acceptable. If you're a practice educator, start to write this into learning agreements. Because in the past, I've seen so many learning agreements that will say they're vague. They'll say something like, what's appropriate dress? Smart casual. Well, what smart casual means to me and what it means to my, 22-year-old daughter who could well be on placement as a student, totally different. Yeah. So we've got to be clearer about boundaries, and we've got to, I think, put boundaries in place around remote working. So I wanted to
also remember that we're all bound by the professional standards of Social Work England. So understand what those standards represent, because they're the things that will get people in that fitness to practice arena, and conduct is going to be something that people can fall foul of unintentionally, because they haven't had those conversations and they haven't had those clarification. They haven't had they haven't sought those clarification points.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you should never do a pile of ironing. Ironing is such a waste of time. But I think they don't need ironing.
Right. Yeah, you don't even. Yeah, it's not even full stop. It's not even do a pile of ironing. Never do a pile of ironing in a team meeting.
I never iron.
Never iron. Yeah, much better advice, Farah. Absolutely, I much prefer that advice. But just to, I just wanted to raise this with you, because also I think, maybe we can debate it. I'll read the chat later. But I also know that there are some university lecturers who are delivering from home, and I think engaging in behaviours that to me are not appropriate on screen. And students are learning that. They're picking that up from their university lecturers, and they're then bringing that out. So all of us need to think about tightening up boundaries in some ways, because when this all started, we were just trying to get on with and do what we were doing, but there need to be some boundaries in place. We have fun at the webinars. We've done things like, I don't know, we did Club Tropicana of reflective writing. We do that. It's an evening. You're all giving up your own time. The boundaries in this are different than the boundaries in your working day. Some of the fun that we have in chat is okay, but it's because this is in your own time. It's not part of your working day. So just think about your kind of what you're learning, and
I've just seen one of the chats about managers not putting on their cameras, and that is something that social workers have shared with me. within my own authority. And my view would be that there are lots of circumstances why people might be uncomfortable about having the video camera on, but it's about having that conversation about the impact. So if I'm a manager and I need to engage in quite difficult conversations and you can't at least see my face, that is something that needs to be explored. And it's about having the conversation in a way that says it's not, in terms of reflection. And maybe some of the discussions that managers have had is that some of the time, because of their home environment, might mean that they've got the cameras off, but not all of the meetings are like that. And I think because we are at the moment, it might change in coming weeks and months, we are at the moment where we can do in-person situations. So it may well be that some of those one-to-one sessions might need to be agreed a mutual point. If the video bits can't happen with cameras on, where can they operate in a different way, a different space?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think cameras are essential. I think it's essential to be able to see somebody when you're talking about really sensitive topics. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for what you've done with us tonight, Farah and Sharon. Brilliant, just to think about, and I think start us thinking about some of these issues and some of new ways of working. And thank you for letting me hijack it a bit at the end there with some of my experiences of working remotely. And they are honestly all true. And there are many others that I could share with you that, would just make you think, never, don't believe it. So thank you so much. If you could just finish on the final slide for me, Farah, because I know that people like to know what we've got coming up. So there we go. We've just got 2 sessions left this season, and then we'll start back again in January. Next week, we're looking at friendship. I think that's going to be really interesting, thinking about the importance of friendship for us, thinking about the importance of friendship for the people we work with. I think it's a fascinating topic, because there are so many people who actually are driven by a need to have friends, and then maybe there's judgments made about safeguarding issues, cuckooing, all kinds of issues that there are that relate to friendship in social work that we often don't think about. So I'm really looking forward to that session next week, which again is a guest-led session. And then we'll be finishing up, as we always do, we finish every season with a team-led A to Z session. And this time we're going to be looking at anti-oppressive practice with an A to Z. And the team are already arguing about which letters they're going to have. So you could already start as the audience thinking about what your A to Z of anti-oppressive practice would be. So we'll be finishing with that the final week. So links to register for those are in the chat now. So if you want to go straight into registering ready for next week or for the week after, that'd be fabulous. And we look forward to seeing you all then. So once again, Farah and Sharon, thank you ever so much, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.